Hello, and welcome to the Week 6 video lecture on Introduction to Living Systems. Please be sure to review this lecture before Monday, the 22nd of February. Let's start off with a definition of ecology. Ecology is the study of organisms and how they interact with each other and their environment. The major tenet of ecology is interaction. So at what different levels can we look at interaction? Well, we can look at interaction between individuals. For example, two male bighorn sheep competing for a mate. We can look at interaction between an individual and the population it belongs to. For example, colony nesting birds competing for nesting habitat. We can look at interaction of an individual to its surrounding physical environment. For example, bald eagles choosing particular trees to build their nests in. We can study interaction between an individual and members of other species. For example, our great gray owl here going after one of its prey species on the snow, a mouse. And we can study interactions between populations, either same species populations or different species populations. For example, we can look at the interactions between a pack of wolves and one of its prey species, the American bison. And lastly, we can look at interactions between whole populations and their physical environment. For example, looking for food resources, weather, shelter resources, etc. And a good example of that is a herd of caribou migrating over a tundra area and how those large numbers of animals impact their environment as they migrate through it. These are just some examples of different levels of interaction that we can study. This is not a comprehensive list. Biologists have organized their study of ecology into a hierarchy of 7 different levels. 1, the organism. 2nd level, population, community, ecosystem, landscape, region, and biosphere. We will be covering organism, population, and community in this PowerPoint. We'll start with organism. The definition of an organism is an individual of a species. So what are some of the biological and ecological interactions that we might look at within an individual? Well, we might look at its metabolism. How quickly does it metabolize food that it intakes? We could look at its behavior. Does it exhibit particular behaviors throughout different seasons or at different times of year? We can study the anatomy and physiology of an individual organism. We can look at that organism's bodily flora and fauna. We can look at brain evolution and development. And we can look at something like mating rituals. The next level of study within ecology is population. A population is a group of individuals of a single species in a particular area. And it's important here, since we use the term species within this definition, to actually define that word species. A species is a set of individuals that uniquely share certain characteristics and can breed with one another to produce fertile offspring. So, what are some of the biological and ecological factors that you would want to learn about a population? Here is a list. We might want to look at abundance and distribution, population density, sex ratio, fertility rate or reproductive potential, age distribution, competition, population genetics, or life history strategy. And we'll go through each of these in detail. We'll start with abundance and distribution. First, abundance. This basically is population size. And why is that important? You might recall when we talked about carrying capacity earlier in the semester that the number of individuals that can inhabit a certain area is directly related to the amount of resources available to support that population size. This is why abundance is important. And then distribution. Where are these populations located? Are they located in just North America, in just New England, or are they located in different places worldwide? And there are 3 key conditions that limit the places where a specific organism can be found. The first is geographical barriers. For example, oceans, deserts, mountain ranges, basically barriers that prevent an organism from getting from point A to point B, whether it's by crawling, swimming, flying, or say floating across the barrier. And I want to point out that there are some incredible exceptions to this rule, most notably some bird migrations. Second is physical barriers or physical factors. This is a situation where organisms may not be present in areas where there's not enough sunlight, a certain oxygen concentration, appropriate temperatures or salinity or pH, or enough water or mineral nutrients. Those abiotic factors can limit where some organisms can be distributed. And then third, interaction with other species. Other species can present competition, may block survival, may behave as predators or parasites, and may inhibit the efficient use of shelter, preventing an organism from being distributed within a certain or throughout a certain area. Next, let's talk about population density. And here I want to do a brief carrying capacity review. I just mentioned it in the previous slide, and this would be a good time for you to flip back in your notes to week 2, where we talked about carrying capacity in detail. As a quick review, you might recall that we talked about lynx and snowshoe hare populations to represent carrying capacity. Here's a graph in the upper right-hand portion of the slide that shows the really close correlation between these two populations. Since lynx are so keyed into snowshoe hare as they are single prey species, as snowshoe hare populations fluctuate, we see the lynx populations fluctuate very similarly. Without enough snowshoe hare for food, the lynx can't survive. Sex ratio. This is basically the number of females related to the number of males. And this is important because if you have a population that has an overabundance of one gender and an underabundance of another gender, that can really impact reproductive scenarios. So if you have a population that has 55 individuals, but there are only 2 females, that could create a problem. Next is fertility rate or reproductive potential. And this is basically how many offspring each female are producing. So if you remember when we talked about human population and about populations and how they work in general, reproductive potential is measured in terms of female reproductive output. So in this case, thinking about populations of animals other than humans, we would be looking at litter size, average reproduction per year, survival rate of those offspring, that sort of thing. Next is age distribution. For example, we might ask ourselves the questions, what are the ages of the individuals within the population? Is the population aging, as in there's a majority of older individuals? Is it a young population where there's a lot of young individuals? Are they sexually mature or immature? All of those things can contribute to how a population behaves. Next is competition. When we're thinking about competition within a population, think about individuals within that population competing for mates, competing for food resources, or competing for habitat, those sorts of things. Next is population genetics. This is where biologists actually take something like a blood sample and analyze the DNA of individuals within populations. And they might do this to see if there's a lot of relatedness amongst the population, or if there's a lot of diversity in the population. And DNA is a really unique and targeted way to evaluate these sorts of things. And it's becoming more and more popular and easier to access because it's cheaper all the time. And then last under population is life history strategy. And this is the way an organism allocates energy to growth, survival, and reproduction. There are many different life history strategies that exist, and they tend to have a strong connection to whether an organism has a long or short lifespan. For example, if an individual allocates most of its resources to growth, there may not be enough allocated towards attracting a mate or producing strong gametes for reproduction. Or another example is if an individual allocates all its energy towards strong gametes and attracting a mate, it will have too little time and energy left for day-to-day survival activities like food acquisition. Next, let's talk about community. A community is an association of interacting species. And here we're talking more about interaction. So let's think about some different ways or different types of interaction. Not levels like we talked about in earlier slides, but different types. For example, predator-prey interactions. And one specific example of a predator-prey relationship is parasitism. Parasitism is a situation where the parasite gets benefit and the host is harmed. For example, a tick, like in the lower right-hand corner of the slide. I have the picture of the grizzly with the salmon in the upper right, just as an example of a predator-prey relationship. But the tick is an example of a parasite where if it attaches to you or another animal, it is benefiting by getting a blood meal and it is harming its host by taking blood away from it. Next is mutualism. This is a situation where both species involved in the relationship benefit. For example, pollinator insects. When a bee pollinates a flower, it's getting nectar or pollen in order to make honey for its hive, and it's also helping the plant to distribute its pollen and help in sexual reproduction. Another example of this is when birds peck insects or parasitic bugs off of things like rhinos or hippos or elephants. Next is commensalism. This is where one species gains benefit from the other species, while the other species is neither harmed nor necessarily helped by the relationship. And often symbiosis is an example of a long-term relationship under this category. And you might be familiar with some symbiotic relationships, most notably the clownfish and sea anemone relationship represented in the bottom left. Any of you who have seen Finding Nemo probably have heard or are familiar with this. And then another example is some really specific relationships between particular types of finches that target particular large herbivores like rhinos in the bottom right-hand corner. And they peck the bugs off of the rhinos to help. They get food from eating the bugs, and the rhino is neither really helped or harmed by the finches pecking. And then there's competition. And in this case, I want to talk about two different types of competition: interspecific competition and intraspecific competition. The first one, interspecific competition, is competition between members of two different species. For example, moose and white-tailed deer in our area compete for the same type of browsing habitat as a food resource. On the other hand, there's intraspecific competition, the second one here. That's competition between individuals of the same species. For example, when you have two male brook trout that are competing for breeding rights with a female brook trout, that would be an example of intraspecific competition. Another aspect to communities that is important for studying is keystone species. And a keystone species is an individual species that exerts stronger influence on the structure of the community or ecosystem that it exists in than other species within that ecosystem. A really classic example of this is the sea otter. And you can see this picture of the sea otter that I have in the bottom left is actually a picture of the sea otter eating sea urchins. And this is where this species, the sea otter, exerts its influence as a keystone species. Sea otters live in areas referred to as kelp forests, which you can see in the picture on the right, in the section that says with sea otters. Kelp is a type of seaweed, and sea otters eat the sea urchins that usually eat the seaweed. And as long as the sea otters are there, they'll keep the population of sea urchins in check, which means that the sea urchins are not overeating the kelp. So you can see in that right-hand picture the example of the kelp forest with sea otters, where they would be controlling the sea urchin population, and the section on the right without sea otters, and you can actually see a bunch of sea otters on the bottom of the picture there on the bottom of the ocean. And basically, if you remove sea otters from the picture, the sea urchins population goes crazy and they just consume all of the kelp. So sea otters are a keystone species for that ecosystem. There are many other examples of this. For example, prairie dogs are considered a keystone species, the American bison, salmon, elephants, beavers, and also sea stars. And feel free to look any one of those up for more specific details about those examples as keystone species. Next is invasive species. An invasive species is a non-native species introduced to a new area that wreaks havoc on that ecosystem. And humans are often instrumental in helping to distribute invasive species. One example of a plant-based invasive species is something called purple loosestrife. And you can see in this picture here, it's actually a really pretty flower. But you can also see in this picture that this purple loosestrife population expands way out and far in back of where the person who's taking the picture is standing. Purple loosestrife is an invasive species that was used as a landscaping flower, and it turns out that it's really good at competing for resources within wetland environments. And when it gets out away from landscaping uses into wetland environments, it completely takes over them and basically outcompetes and chokes out everything else that's there. So you can have a nice diverse wetland habitat with lots of different plants and fungi and bacteria and animals that live in that wetland. And when purple loosestrife gets introduced as an invasive species, it takes over that area and decreases diversity and decreases the organisms that can use that habitat. Another example of an invasive species is zebra mussels, and you can see a picture of them in the middle on the top. They have a very distinct zebra stripe characteristic. Zebra mussels are known as being an invasive because they're really good at colonizing on any type of surface. And so they grow like mad and they choke out marine and freshwater ecosystems. And you can see in the picture in the bottom right, or the maps in the bottom right, that in 1990, zebra mussels were just located around and throughout the Great Lakes. But then by 10 years later in 2000, they had been distributed to many places throughout the central and bordering into the eastern parts of the US. And again, they're an invasive because they take over ecosystems and choke out those aquatic and marine ecosystems, preventing other organisms from living there. And then lastly, we're going to talk about trophic interaction, but I'm not going to go over that here in the PowerPoint because it's a little more complicated and involves a fairly detailed diagram. So we're going to go over trophic interaction and something called the trophic pyramid when we meet in class on Monday.